Have you ever had that feeling, a premonition, that something simply isn't right? That's what led me to take to the road that night. It wasn't curiosity, nor a desire for adventure. It was necessity, an escape. My name is John, and what I'm about to tell you isn't just any story. It's a true account, a piece of my life that, to this day, makes me question the reality that surrounds us. The decision to leave wasn't planned. It came after weeks where work stress, constant pressure, and a suffocating feeling of being trapped in a vicious cycle consumed me to the core. On that day, after a tense phone argument, I simply couldn't take it anymore. It was as if every part of me was screaming for a breather, for a moment of silence away from the chaos of the big city. So, without a second thought, I grabbed a few things, threw them in the car, and started driving, with no destination, seeking only the calmness that seemed so distant. Night had already taken over when I decided to leave the city lights behind. The road was empty, a solitary path that seemed to stretch into infinity under the cloak of night. There was something almost therapeutic about that solitude, that silence broken only by the sound of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. But this peace wouldn't last. It was when the fog started to form thick and fast, enveloping everything around me. Visibility became almost non-existent, and the feeling of isolation intensified. It was in the midst of this fog that I saw the figure for the first time. A silhouette by the roadside, a dark figure hitching a ride in a place where no living soul should be. I hesitated, of course. Everything in my being told me to keep going, not to stop. But something, a force I couldn't understand, compelled me to slow down and eventually stop. That was the moment that changed everything. The decision that would lead me to question not only my sanity, but the very fabric of the reality that surrounds us. This is the beginning of my story, an account that to this day haunts me in dreams and moments of silence. A story that, as real as it is, becomes almost unbelievable. A journey in which the entity asked for a ride, and I almost paid with my life. As soon as he got in, a wave of cold ran through the car, a cold that didn't seem natural, that didn't dissipate with the heating on. He introduced himself as Edward, his voice low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight, a gravity that made my heart race for no apparent reason. He pointed ahead, asking me to follow a road I had never noticed before. It was a narrow, poorly lit path that veered off the main one. "It's a shortcut," he said, with a certainty that made me question whether he really knew the area or something more. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. The radio, which was off, began turning on and off by itself, alternating between static and fragments of songs I had never heard. Whispers that made no sense. The car's dashboard flickered for no reason, and a feeling of being watched settled in, making me look repeatedly in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something other than the two of us. I tried to start a conversation, trying to ignore the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. Edward spoke little, and when he did, it was in riddles. "Be careful what you wish for in the darkness," he muttered once, an almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "It may wish you back." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the talk as attempts to scare a lone driver. But there was something about him, about the way he spoke, that made my stomach churn with anxiety. The road became more and more isolated, the fog denser, as if we were entering another world. And it was in the middle of this god-forsaken road that Edward disappeared. It wasn't gradual. One moment he was there, and the next he simply wasn't. The seat next to me was empty, with no sign that anyone had been there. I stopped the car, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, and looked around, expecting to see him standing on the road, perhaps laughing at the cruel joke. But there was no one, just the road, the fog, and the silence. Disoriented, I got out of the car, calling out the name Edward, in a voice I barely recognized as my own. The surrounding forest seemed to consume every sound I made, leaving only a distant echo that quickly got lost in the mist. My heart raced, part of me wanting to get back in the car and drive away from there as fast as possible, while another part, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, compelled me to look for Edward, or for any explanation for what was happening. It didn't take long for me to regret that decision. The atmosphere became even more oppressive as I moved away from the car, the mist so thick it became difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. It was then that I began to hear the sounds, almost imperceptible whispers, distant laughter, as if the forest were alive, watching every step I took. Without any warning, the forest opened up to a clearing where the mist seemed to recede, as if respecting an invisible boundary. In the center, I found traces of something my brain struggled to understand. Marks on the ground, symbols that seemed to dance in the dim light, forming patterns that filled me with a primal terror. It was as if I had stumbled upon an ancient secret, something that should not be disturbed. It was then that the visions began. Images of indescribable violence, of pain and suffering, flashes of moments that seemed both strange and painfully familiar. They were so vivid, so intense that they made me stumble backwards, trying to escape that alternate reality that was imposing itself on mine. With my heart in my mouth, I ran back to the car, each step echoing in the silence that now seemed to suffocate me. The mist swallowed me up, making it increasingly difficult to breathe, increasingly difficult to distinguish the real from the imaginary. When I finally reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely insert the key into the ignition. All I wanted was to escape, to leave behind the clearing, the symbols, the visions. But as I started the car, I realized that the road I had come from had changed, as if the very earth had reorganized itself in my absence, guiding me even deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. In an almost panicked state, I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, although every turn seemed to lead me deeper into an unknown place. It was as if Edward, even in his absence, was manipulating the path, twisting the reality around him to confine me within this labyrinth of trees and fog. With every kilometer traveled, the feeling of being guided into a trap intensified, a growing despair taking hold of me. The gas was starting to run low, a cruel reminder of my vulnerability and how isolated I was. The fear of being stranded there, on that endless road, began to mingle with the horrific images Edward had planted in my mind. Visions of ghostly apparitions appeared by the roadside, empty eyes fixed on me as if waiting for a moment of weakness to consume me. Then, when hope seemed like nothing more than a distant memory, the road finally opened up to the main highway. A sight so unexpected that I almost couldn't believe it. The relief, however, was fleeting. As I looked at the passenger seat, my heart stopped. Edward was there, as real as before, his cold smile piercing me. "You can't escape," he whispered. And the truth of those words hit me with the force of a fist. The ensuing struggle was both physical and psychological. Every attempt I made to expel him from the car or regain control was met with a supernatural force, Edward manipulating my perception, distorting the reality around him to weaken me. It was a battle I was losing, each attack from him more devastating than the last, each defense of mine more desperate. At the height of my terror and exhaustion, something unexpected happened. In a moment of clarity, I managed to focus enough to make a risky maneuver, swerving the car off the side of the road in an attempt to rid myself of Edward. The car spun out of control, but when it stopped, he had vanished, leaving only the echo of his laughter in my mind. Trembling, I looked around, expecting him to reappear at any moment, but I was alone, at least for now. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. With every kilometer I put between myself and that place, I knew Edward, or whatever he was, still haunted me, waiting for the moment to return. The relief of having escaped was short-lived. Although Edward was no longer physically by my side, his presence was still felt. a constant reminder that the fight was far from over. I found a gas station a few kilometers ahead and stopped, more out of a need to reassure myself that I was still in control than for the gas itself. There, I tried to share my story with the attendant in the vain hope of finding some form of validation or, who knows, an explanation. But the words sounded as crazy to my own ears as they did to his. I received looks of pity and disbelief and soon gave up, walking away before they took me for insane. I was determined to continue my journey. Every kilometer traveled a test of my sanity. The road seemed normal now, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, remained. Strange events continued to happen. Shadows that moved on their own, sounds with no apparent source, and the constant feeling of cold, even with the heater on full blast. I began to question my own perception of reality, wondering if Edward had somehow altered my ability to discern what was real from what was not. Attempts to rest were fruitless. Every time I closed my eyes, the visions would begin. Vivid nightmares of pursuit, of Edward whispering horrors into my ear, of being dragged into an endless darkness. I would wake up sweating, my heart racing, the line between dream and reality growing ever thinner. It was in one of those moments of despair that I noticed the marks. Looking in the bathroom mirror of a roadside motel, I saw strange symbols etched into my skin. Marks I didn't remember making, but recognized from the patterns I had seen in that forest clearing. They burned on my flesh, a physical reminder of Edward's presence, of his influence over me. I tried to wash them, scratch them off, but nothing removed them. It was as if they were engraved not just on my skin, but on my very soul. With each passing day, Edward made himself more present, his voice a constant in my mind, his threats growing ever more real. I was lost, unsure of how to fight against something that could not be touched, against an enemy that inhabited not only the world around me, but the inside of my own head. In a desperate attempt to find a solution, I began researching paranormal phenomena, entities, and how they could be confronted or banished. I spent hours in local libraries and online, poring over ancient books and obscure websites, searching for anything that could give me an advantage, a glimmer of hope. It was in one of those searches that I found references to ancient symbols and rituals of protection, fragmented pieces of information that seemed to form a path through the darkness Edward had brought into my life. Armed with this fragile knowledge, I prepared myself for what I knew would be a final confrontation. I could no longer run, could no longer allow Edward to control my life, my reality. One night I chose an isolated spot, far from any main road, a place where if something went wrong, I wouldn't endanger anyone else. With symbols drawn around me, and the words of rituals echoing in the darkness, I waited. Edward didn't take long to manifest, first as a shadow on the edges of my vision, then as a physical presence, more terrifying than ever. His eyes shone with a cold malice, and the laughter that escaped his lips was the sound of my own despair. But I was determined. With each word of the ritual, with each mark I had studied, I felt a strength growing inside me, a conviction that I could, somehow, end this. The struggle was more intense than I could have imagined. Every move I made was countered by Edward with a supernatural force, each symbol I drew in the air seeming to be erased by his mere presence. But I persisted, fueled by desperation and anger, by the need to regain control of my life. And then, in a moment that seemed both an eternity and an instant, something gave. Edward screamed, a sound that tore through the night and then dissipated like smoke carried away by the wind. Exhausted, I collapsed to the ground, staring at the empty space where Edward had been. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, that I had won. But as I rose, trembling and weak, a cruel doubt settled in. What if it hadn't been enough? What if Edward came back? With a heavy heart, I returned to the car, the night's silence a cold and lonely companion. I had survived, but at what cost, and for how long? The road ahead seemed endless, every shadow a reminder that the struggle might never truly end. The days that followed were shrouded in a fog of uncertainty. I continued my journey, each destination chosen at random, as if fleeing could lead me somewhere free from Edward's shadow. But no matter where I stopped, be it a small town or a roadside diner, the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, followed me. I saw figures in the corner of my eye, heard whispers at the edge of my consciousness, growing ever more convinced that Edward was still with me. Perhaps not physically, but somehow imbued into my very soul. At one of those stops, I found an old hotel that promised a night's rest. But sleep was a distant memory. Every shadow cast by the streetlight became a threat. Every sound a potential manifestation of Edward. And then, in the darkness, the mark on my skin began to burn. A painful reminder that the battle was far from over. Desperate for answers, for anything that could give me hope, I began to seek more. More knowledge, more power. Anything that could give me an edge against Edward. I knew I couldn't face him alone, that the rituals and symbols were only part of the solution. But what more could I do? Each search, each book opened, seemed only to lead me deeper into a world I barely understood. A world where the line between the real and supernatural grew ever more tenuous. And then, on a particularly dark night when the moon seemed to hide from me, I realized Edward would never leave me. No matter how many symbols I drew, how many words of power I uttered. He was intertwined with my existence in a way I did not yet fully grasp. I was marked, both physically and spiritually, and perhaps that was the true nature of my struggle. It wasn't a matter of winning or losing, but of surviving, of continuing to push forward even when each step seemed to draw me closer to the abyss. With this realization, I continued my journey, each destination less important than the movement itself. It was a nomadic existence, a constant flight from shadows that may have only existed in my head. But what else could I do? The road ahead was all I had. Each mile traveled a small victory against the darkness that pursued me. And for now, that would have to be enough. The road became my refuge and my prison. Every town I passed through was merely a blurred smear in my memory. Every face a possible disguise for Edward. Every shadow a hiding place for him. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. My mind a whirlwind of paranoia and fear. It was an exhausting existence running from something that may have been impossible to escape. On one of those restless nights, as I tried to rest in yet another cheap motel room, the visions returned with an intensity I did not expect. Edward, or the idea of him that had taken root in my mind, haunted me with promises of despair and ruin. I saw the marks on my skin pulsing with a black light, symbols of a contract I had unwittingly signed by giving him a ride on that forsaken road. In a moment of profound desperation, I decided to confront these visions. I could not allow Edward, real or not, to continue dominating my life. Utilizing the scant knowledge I had gathered, I began tracing protective symbols around the room, murmuring words of power that I hoped would be enough to guard me from Edward's clutches. It was a simple ritual, born more of need and instinct than any ancient wisdom, but it was all I had. The inner struggle that ensued was the most arduous I had ever faced. Every whisper from Edward, every vision he sent my way was met with all the willpower I could muster. It was a battle of attrition. Him trying to break me and me clinging to whatever spark of hope and sanity remained. When dawn finally came, I was alone, the room silent around me. The marks on my skin seemed less intense, as if the ritual had somehow relieved the pressure they exerted on me. I had no illusions that Edward was truly defeated, but that moment of calm was a victory, however small. I knew the road still called to me, that I could not linger in one place for too long. But that morning, for the first time in a long while, I felt something akin to hope. perhaps there was a way to live with the shadows, to accept that they were a part of me now. Perhaps, somehow, I could find peace not through flight but by confronting the darkness that Edward represented. It was a fragile thought, easily shattered, but it was all I had, and with that, I steeled myself to continue my journey, to face whatever the road had in store for me. That morning, something had shifted. The road ahead, once a source of fear and despair, now seemed a challenge, a path to something more, perhaps even a solution. I decided that if Edward, or his essence, still clung to me, I needed to understand more. It couldn't just be a matter of fleeing or confronting the shadows without a plan. I needed answers, true comprehension of what he was and what he wanted from me. It was with this thought that I came upon a small bookstore in a forgotten town I passed through. Something about that place caught my attention, an intuition that compelled me to stop. There, amongst piles of ancient, forgotten books, I found a volume that seemed to speak directly to me. It was a treatise on ancient entities, on how they interact with the world of the living and how, on rare occasions, they choose someone to haunt. Armed with this new knowledge, I knew what I had to do. The next night found me in a place I had carefully chosen, an open space far from any known trail, a place where I could confront Edward without fear of interruption or endangerment. With the book as my guide, I prepared a new ritual, this time not to protect or banish, but to communicate, to understand. Edward did not keep me waiting. As night fell and shadows lengthened, his presence became palpable, almost suffocating. But I was ready. With each word of the ritual, I felt a connection forming, a bridge between my reality and his. When I finally summoned him, he appeared not as the threatening entity I had feared, but as a being of pain and anguish trapped between worlds, his existence an endless torment. The revelation was overwhelming. Edward, or what remained of him, was as lost as I, his bond to me not an act of malice, but a cry for help. Our battle, our confrontations, were not about domination, but about understanding, about the desperate search for liberation. On that night, under the light of a moon that seemed to understand our plight, we struggled together one last time. Not against each other, but against the tethers that bound him to this world and to me. It was a battle of wills, of spiritual fortitude, each of us giving our all to achieve an end we both desired. When dawn came, I was alone again, but something had changed. The air felt lighter, the shadows less threatening. I don't know if Edward found his peace, or if we simply parted ways, our fates finally unbound. What I do know is that on that morning, for the first time in a long while, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I too could find my way back to the light. In the days that followed, the road seemed different to me. It was no longer an escape, but a path back to life, to normalcy, perhaps even to healing. I drove with no destination, no longer fleeing Edward, but distancing myself from the shadow that had dominated my life for so long. Each mile carried me a little closer to myself, to the person I had been before this harrowing journey began. But the truth about these entities, about the shadows that sometimes cross our path, is that they never fully disappear. Deep down, I knew Edward, or what he represented, would always be part of my story. The marks on my skin had faded, but never vanished completely, a permanent reminder of those nights of terror and despair, but also of my struggle to overcome them. On the last night of my journey, I found myself in a small town, a place that seemed almost welcoming. I parked the car and walked the quiet streets, feeling a peace I hadn't known in a long time. But even there, in the tranquil shadows of the night, I could sense something, a memory perhaps, or the sensation that in some way Edward was still with me, no longer a threat, but part of my very soul. As I returned to the car, preparing to journey on, a voice stilled me. It was not menacing, nor filled with pain as before. It was just a whisper, almost carried on the wind, a remembrance of the bonds we had shared, of the battles we had fought. "You will never be alone," it said, and I knew it was true. I drove into the night with no destination, but with a sense of purpose that had eluded me for so long. The road ahead was just a road, but it was also more than that. It was a path through the darkness, a reminder that even in the bleakest moments, there is always a light, however faint. Edward's story and mine may have ended, but the journey continued. And as I drove, I knew the road before me lay open, full of possibilities, of new challenges and new hopes. The terror had been real, the scars permanent, but it had also been a passage, a path to something new. And so, with the night enveloping the world around me, I pressed on, to wherever the road might lead, carrying with me the shadows of the past, no longer as demons, but as parts of myself, eternally intertwined in the tale of my life.